Thanks to everyone for coming to our live event on Top 25 Restaurants. I am Serena Dye. I'm the Senior Features Editor at the San Francisco Chronicle. I oversee food and I work with Soleil, who I have the pleasure of introducing today. Soleil host, she is our esteemed restaurant critic, dining out around the Bay Area to deliver to us the news of which place is the best to eat. Thank you so much to our subscribers for your support. We cannot do this work without you. We really hope you enjoy this event and join us for other events in the future. Be sure to check it out at sfchronicle.com/membership to see other events that we have coming up. So how this is going to work, I'm going to start talking to Soleil a little bit about this huge revamp for the top 100 restaurants. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom. There's also a chat, but it will be easier for us to kind of collect those questions at the end if you do it in the Q&A portion. Yeah. So let's start. Soleil, how you feeling about the launch of Top 25?
Oh my gosh. It just feels like it's such a funny thing to do during a pandemic. And we've already done the top 88 last fall. And now just soldiering on with more lists is kind of like, oh my God. Things change all the time, right? And like getting any information down, like concretely is such a risk right now. As like we just saw this week, right? Like, oh, outdoor dining is open again. And some places are doing it, some places aren't. And flipping that switch is complicated from a data standpoint too.
Yeah, definitely. I guess let's start talking a little bit about why we decided to do this. So I started last year and you pretty much approached me immediately about, hey, what should we do about the top 100 this year? Tell me a little bit about your mindset then about launching a list during a pandemic.
Right. So truth be told, right, I had the list set up and I had all the text set up in February of 2020. And of course, as with many other things, it was derailed completely by the pandemic and shutdowns and all of that stuff. And it just became this back burner project for a while because we didn't know what to do with all this work that we had done. We were set to print the magazine because traditionally the top 100 came with a magazine. We were all set to design everything and like all the data was in. I had gotten it in early. My suffering is the least of all suffering, that has been incurred during this pandemic. But certainly like the idea of doing a top 100 was really intimidating at that point because we had been so rolled into the adrenaline of doing pandemic stories and lockdown stories and all the big politics stories that this little big thing got lost in the shuffle. And I really wanted to make sure it didn't because, we don't do it for restaurants. That's not the purpose of the top 100. It is to serve diners. But at the same time, I was hyper aware of the fact that restaurants were suffering and pop-ups and people who like work at these places really could have used a jolt of positivity. And so that's kind of all those things I was thinking about. Just how do we make something good happen in the midst of all this?
Yeah, definitely. I know that you had mentioned that a lot of the people already knew last year that they were on the top 100, and even though some of them weren't operating anymore. So for that, and for those of you who don't know, we whittled it down to initially top 88, and that number kept changing. Yeah, from top 88 to top 89 to top 90, back down to top 88, just because some places were updating and some places were closing. But I think we got started on that conversation of going down to top 25 right then. At the time, you would kind of talk to me about concerns you had or feedback you've gotten from readers for generally even a year ago, talking about what we could do with the top 100 to make it modern and to make it more nimble. And what was some of the feedback you've gotten since you started as a critic on the top 100 that fed into this change?
Yeah, so I got a lot of feedback about regions, right, of the Bay Area, of which there are a few. Some have been more present in these lists and the coverage of food media in the Bay Area than others. And I wanted to I'm so aware of that. I hear it all the time. And I certainly hear criticism from people in San Francisco for covering regions outside of San Francisco. So it's kind of this push and pull of different agendas. I'm also hyper aware of just being new to the Bay Area, and I am still kind of letting the Bay Area uncover itself to me. And I think it's important to note that when Michael Bauer, the previous critic, started the top 100, he was already, I want to say, gosh, like 10 years in to his job here. He had that experience and he was relying on 10 years worth of restaurant visits to formulate his list. So before he even started it, right, he had all of this in mind. I don't. And I wanted to have to like just be realistic, right? I'm continually being just flummoxed by the things that I find in the Bay Area. And I'm so excited about every new to me thing that I wanted a more dynamic way to cover that and
Mhm.
to treat that because I can't I just don't have the time to put the 10 years of experience into a top 100 list. And so I thought a constantly evolving one just made sense to me. And of course, the necessities of the pandemic have made it even more important to update and adapt because so many things have been changing. And the reason why the top 88 changed so much too is because restaurants that were on the list to start closed. And we had a conversation about just the efficacy of putting on restaurants where people just couldn't go. you know, in the end, we wanted it to be useful to people, not so much like a vanity project or just some kind of list set in stone. We wanted to make sure that people could get some good food from the list.
Yeah, definitely. We had this conversation a lot of what's even the point of a list. Because on one sense, it's a huge honor to be on the list, but on the other, it's not. A lot of restaurant awards did stop for the year 2020, and I understand why they did. But as a media company, as journalists, it's kind of this interesting idea of yes, it's an honor, yes, it's an award, but ultimately we need it to be useful. Ultimately, it needs to be service journalism. And what does it look like for us to do that? And why is it still relevant for us to be doing that? Most of the place in your top 100, even your top 25 now, it was struck me for your top 25 this round. For so everyone knows, Soleil really just, she's very independent. She chooses these places and she makes her own judgments and to make sure it's a good snapshot of what the best of the region has to offer right now. For example, there's less fine dining on it this round. And I think that speaks to the fact that right now it's really difficult for fine dining to operate because so much of it is based on setting and um, speed. And that's not necessarily conducive to take on a delivery.
Right. And quite a few fine dining places just closed either temporarily or permanently because of just the restrictions on outdoor dining and indoor dining. So putting them on a list wouldn't have been, again, like very useful to diners. Now, the second iteration with our second quarter one might look really different now that outdoor dining is allowed again. So again, like it speaks to the dynamicism of what's been going on here.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I came into, I'm also new to the Bay Area, and I was very much thinking what's going to be useful to me as someone who uh, is just really excited to eat out here and really excited to check everything out. And to me, 100 once a year, 100 restaurants is almost too many. It felt a little bit overwhelming, and 25 to me feels doable. Feels like okay, this quarter I can really pick off some things on here that I want to try. So I'm a big fan of the smaller number. What's the feedback been for you for the reduced count?
I think it's been mostly positive. I think people like you're saying find it more manageable and easier to use to plan out their lives. There are some features in it that I really liked, like the Google Maps integration, where you could find each kind of place on the Google map and like make your own list on that platform. You could copy paste like just plain text your own like picks from the list so that you can just copy it to your notes app or whatever. So you don't have to pull up the whole website every time you want to like check on where you want to go, which I think is bad for us as far as page views go, but it's good for the reader. So I think that's a good compromise, because you don't want to have to pull up someone else's website all the time if you're like out and about and maybe there's no reception where you are. Like there's all kinds of disaster scenarios that um, could interfere with your search for good food. I mean, I think I think just the idea too that right now it's a snapshot of like what you can get. And that means that places that are already amenable to takeout and delivery are on the list. Places that do shawarma and tacos and pizza, right? There are like two pizza places that do really interesting takeout sushi. I think it speaks to the moment in a way that is really fun, just as a historical document too.
Yeah, definitely. And again, for the audience, if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask them, and I will try and answer them for you. Um, yeah, I think the other thing is when looking at restaurants, this updating them quarterly and having it be shorter for me was really exciting because there is so much competition out there for where people can get their restaurants and where people can get the recommendations. And for me personally, I don't trust a lot of the options. I think that time has shown that Yelp is really complicated. Um, Even Instagram and food influencers can be a really complicated market. There's not necessarily, I guess I'm fairly traditional in that way, is that there's not always transparency in that. And for user generated sites like Yelp, that's a super valuable tool. But I like the idea of someone like you who's an expert, who really knows food. You've cooked food, you are obsessed with food, and you've turned yourself into someone who really knows all aspects of the creation of it, and can make those comparisons. And so I felt that if I wanted the most up-to-date thing, I would want your opinion on it, which is why I think we're updating it quarterly. Um, that said, 100 is a lot more than 25. Will you talk a little bit about your top list and why we did that?
Yeah. So as some of you may know, we have a lot, like I guess like a constellation, a pantheon of top lists that accompany the sort of main one, right? And they're a lot more broken down by genre, like sushi potentially, and pizza, and some regional like East Bay and Chinatown and SF. And I thought that, well, I was on board with this idea because it enabled us to bring in a lot more great restaurants and enabled us to talk about them more frequently. It was really useful for readers, of course, but it was a way to stretch out more specifically and really focus and give people, like, if someone's a vegetarian and they might not find the top list, like the main top, that useful to them, they'll go to the vegetarian list and find some really great suggestions as well. um, and so, yeah, there are a lot of lists that will, I think, cater to these other regions outside of San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley, where they've had a pretty good representation historically. I'd love to do a peninsula list, for instance, or a San Jose list. So I just need to figure out how to get there more reliably these days, since Caltrain's not working super great. But yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, Russell just asked, top 25 is fine, but having a larger number gives us more localized possibility of picking. Is there a possibility of having several top 25 lists like these other lists? And yeah, the answer is yes. These other lists won't necessarily have 25 restaurants on them. They will range in number, but the concept of switching things up this way is, like Soleil said, one of the biggest. When I first got here, you mentioned again that a big complaint was geography and people wanting stuff in their neighborhoods, especially during the pandemic. And I think this was a way. I think no list can be everything for everybody. Like you mentioned, like you may be vegetarian, but there might only be, 5 vegetarian restaurants in the top 100. But next month, Soleil will be putting out a top vegetarian list. It might not have 25 restaurants on it, but we'll have a broader range of restaurants on there. Or there's already a top East Bay list. And you can find all of those if you go to the top 25 page on our website. If you scroll down there, or even at the top, there's a link, you can check other lists, and there you will see all the other top lists that Soleil has already put out. And so not all of those restaurants on the top East Bay list are going to be on the top 25, but Soleil still recommends them as the top within that region. And so, Soleil's only one person. She is actually going out and trying these restaurants and comparing them. And so they're coming out a little bit slowly, but definitely if you have something you feel strongly about or are really interested in seeing her doing, her email is very easy to find. You can you can ask her to do it. Meanwhile, the top 25 I think is still an incredible honor. And so if you go to those top lists, oftentimes we will mark well, I don't think we've done it. Actually, I don't think we've done it for our most recent ones, but we're demarking which restaurants on the top, on like the top vegetarian list are also on the top 25. To kind of give those restaurants an extra boost and notable, just to kind of say, not only is this one of the best restaurants in the East Bay, it's also one of the best restaurants in the entire Bay Area.
Right. Yeah. And I also just want to say, I've been slowly picking my way out as travel restrictions have gotten a little less, restrictive. And I am just so excited to do these regional lists. So if you want them, I am on the same page as you. I am very excited to do them and really put in the work because, of course, you can't eat all of San Jose's amazing restaurants in one weekend. So yeah, it takes time, it takes work, and I'm so invested in making sure that the final list is awesome.
So another question, how often do you visit a restaurant before rating it?
So it's gotten kind of, the standard is like 3, right? It depends on the story. Sometimes if I'm just doing a feature on like the kind of intricacies of like how a chef is doing something, I'll go like 1, 2 times. So it really depends on the context of it and just like what is necessary to communicate, right? If it's a full review, right now I wasn't visiting restaurants necessarily, but I ordered from them a bunch to compare different menus and all of that. So like certain pop-ups, for instance, that had different menus. I tried to try as many of those menus as I could.
Yeah, someone was asking, how has the pandemic changed your dining and reporting habits?
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. The coronavirus like really freaks me out. I have some, pre-existing conditions, and I know I'm fairly certain if I get it, it's not going to be great for me. And so it's made me really nervous, actually, and anxious. I still have my job and I do my job. But it's just added a layer of anxiety to it that I didn't have before. And, certainly for many other people in the food business at large. So yes, like on a personal level, a psychological level, it's made it really difficult. But on a practical level, certainly like I didn't think about takeout as part of a restaurant's fair game, I guess, for me as a critic, because you always, everything that a restaurant does for takeout, you kind of assume it's probably worse than eating it in person. Things like fried chicken, for instance, French fries, noodles, pasta, like fresh pasta gets really clumpy, when you pick it up. So I've had to be a little bit more flexible in just like what I would say, because there are certain things they can't control, right? Like they can't control how far your drive is from the restaurant to your house. That's nothing they have to do with. They can't control the fact that people who are trying to get food are like maybe not wearing their masks right. And you have to like, be proactive in like making sure that they know that they can say things to customers, because sometimes they're really uncomfortable with doing that. There's a lot that goes on with just the getting of food now that wasn't present before.
Yeah, you have a very enviable job, but there is a lot of anxiety related to it during the pandemic. Another question. So someone is happy to see many affordable restaurants included, but don't want to lose the expertise that you bring in for special occasion restaurants. How this new approach balance these different price points and types of restaurants?
Well, yeah, I am still interested in seeing this like broad range of restaurants. Um, I will say that a lot of the high-end restaurants have started doing more affordable options lately too, and so that's kind of the tough part. And also taking into account that many people in the Bay Area and our readership have had like really significant blows to their income, and trying to be sensitive to that as well in my coverage. I think just there is a really high demand for affordable options, and also our definition of affordable has changed a lot since last year as well. So yeah, it's a delicate balance, but I still, I'm still very interested in seeing like what kind of what exists all along the spectrum of dining here.
Yeah, I think that right now it doesn't feel like it I feel like I am interested in seeing, me personally, I'm interested in seeing you do a top list of just splurgy restaurants, like just
Mhm.
restaurants for special occasions. I think that is super important. And as someone who does love fine dining, but doesn't really want to spend money at places unless I'm sure it's going to be good, because they are quite expensive, especially here in the Bay Area. I think that's something that I personally would love to see you do, to answer that question as well. And I think that's really great room for a separate top list as well. But like Soleil said, it's right now, it's the reality is that a lot of those restaurants just aren't open. A lot of the places that or just doing things that are so completely different, because the market's just not the same as it was when dine-in service was available. Just a little tease though, she is reviewing some luxury experiences fairly soon. And so you can look out for that review. But as far as top lists go, that's absolutely right. I think the special occasion restaurants are an incredibly important aspect of the dining world. And this is not, just because they're not as much in this top 25 doesn't mean that they won't be back. And it doesn't mean that that need will not be serviced for people.
Right. Yeah. And I'm curious too, like on an intellectual level and social level, right? How prolific will the luxury restaurants be with the sort of a supposed tech migration out of the Bay Area, right? Because a lot of their patrons and investors, right, were part of these companies that are potentially looking elsewhere. So yeah, it's so fascinating to see how that will change as well.
Yeah, on the alternative side, they're leaving, but also because of, like you mentioned, there's so much. Many people don't have as much income, and in my experience, what tends to get lost in there is the middle area of mid-range restaurants. Whereas through the pandemic, a lot of people have been able to keep their jobs, and there is a lot of people who've not been spending money that they would have been spending, and so it's also completely possible, I think, that the high end there'll be even more high end, and then super lots of low end, and it's our way affordable, cheap, quote unquote cheap eat style stuff. In the middle is of just neighborhood restaurant is gonna maybe have more challenges moving forward. But I mean, none of us can really predict the future from that end, but there are a lot of possibilities.
Right. I mean, when you think about and this is just talking now, but so excuse me, but if you think about the PPP, for instance, the Paycheck Protection Program, it's the larger companies that had, multiple restaurants, Shake Shack, for instance, um, that were able to get really sizable loans for their restaurants. Shake Shack, I think Danny Meyer's company rejected the loan, but like, where does that money go after? We don't know. Certainly
Mhm.
wasn't going to neighborhood restaurants. But the idea that, and Lucas Peterson wrote about this in the LA Times, the idea that we'll have a larger proliferation of fast food restaurants is very relevant and a real possibility.
Yeah. All right, definitely some more questions. Soleil, how do you look at balancing between restaurants that are well-known institutions versus new spots, such as pop-ups, that may be from alums of those same perennial favorites? Do you feel a responsibility to give some credit both to places that have underpinned local food culture and the vanguard?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to like see what is a classic and what isn't, and also just I guess the legacy of these restaurants, where so many people have come out of these kitchens to do like super fascinating stuff. um, and I'm thinking, I guess I've had to be really just realistic about like what I would expect out of a classic restaurant. For example, like House of Prime Rib, for instance, I went to a bunch of times last year just to see, right? And other ones I like go again to like calibrate essentially and to see like, is this still good or am I just sort of um, imagining it or letting it kind of blow up because everyone around me loves this place. So I've had to do a lot of just sort of gut check visits to places. And often, you know, the alumni of these places do really good work. And if I see that happening, it helps guide like where I want to go after those initial visits too. Like maybe the talent has moved on and I want to like hear about it and like see how it's kind of blossomed elsewhere. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it's always I don't know, it's almost like if you have been at a restaurant like a classic institution or even a well-known name like the French Laundry and you know this person has worked there, you kind of know the standard of those places and it's hard to not take another look if one of the former chefs is doing a pop-up now. It's like, okay, you know that there's a certain level of precision and you're at least going to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also, I feel like you've also covered some pop-ups that didn't necessarily have these long resumes as well. And it's definitely a balance of that. And you don't really know until you try.
Right, but even now more so, so many people who have been, you know, laid off from their restaurants, like their stable gigs, have figured out like other ways to keep afloat and pay the rent. And I think that is a really important part of the food scene here to keep track of as well. Because like they could probably would still work at, you know, X, Y, and Z place if they could, but they just practically like they can't, they don't have the job. So just keeping my eyes on where people are going and what they're doing with their time now is also a really important part of the job for me.
All right, another question. What kind of permanent changes do you think that we'll see in restaurants as a result of the pandemic?
Mm. Oh yeah, I mean that's weird to think about, right? If we look to places that have sort of gone past their surges, like in New Zealand or even in China, there's certainly like I don't know, things have come back in a way, but people are a lot more careful. I think, just from what I've observed about just making sure it stays away. So I think we will have a sort of interpersonal distance from people for a while now. Um, I don't know if that's a very positive take, but I also think that we'll probably adapt mass culture, which is so endemic to East Asia for sure. I think that will be a regular part of life now throughout the world. But
I
I
hope
guess
so.
as far as restaurants go, I think about the story of Single Thread like in Sonoma. I guess no, it's in Healdsburg, but Sonoma County. And they have made this pivot from fine dining to emergency, you know, takeout slash sort of charitable work so many times because of the fires in that region. And so when they made the pivot because of the pandemic, they were comfortable. They knew how to do this. They knew how to access the charitable organizations around them, the neighbors, like the sort of other ways of getting funding and talking to the community about what they were doing. And I think that's a model to think about. I think a lot of these other restaurants around the Bay Area are now going to be seasoned. They're going to be ready to change up their services at the drop of a hat because just when you go through so many emergencies at once, right, you get it, and you're able to have that in your pocket for the next time. So it might not be an outwardly visible change, but I think psychologically, logistically, that will change, and that has changed.
Yeah, just being more adaptable, knowing the community more as well, and knowing who the neighbors are and who could possibly. I mean, restaurants have always needed to know exactly who their regulars are to be successful, but I imagine that that will continue and to be a necessity moving on. I mean, Janelle just wrote a story, our colleague, about how there's all these pop-ups right now because they're out of work chefs trying to make it work. But now some of them are like, we're just going to be pop-ups forever. This is more flexible. Brick and mortar is really, really tough. There are certain things about it besides rent and having more labor that just makes it really difficult to be as quick on your feet. Um, I imagine that'll continue. I think the pop-up culture is gonna stay.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. And I remember Alameda County having hearings about AB 626, for instance, their cottage food law, which they hadn't adopted yet, because AB 626 is the law that allows people to make food at home if they get a permit and sell it. And I think the only county in California that adopted it was Riverside. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I
Um,
think so, yeah.
yeah,
In Southern California.
and there was a lot of, of course, people who were laid off had to figure out what to do, and their skill is cooking. And if you can't cook for the public through a restaurant, you have to find a way. You're not going to get a job doing anything else right now. So there were some really public crackdowns of operations like broke ass cooks, for instance, the Manish lady in Oakland. And it really galvanized people to advocate for cottage food law adoption in the Bay Area, especially in Alameda County. And it seems like it's going forward. Maybe, I mean, there's of course hearings upon hearings, but that's potentially another big change that'll happen. It's just more and more people getting permits to cook food at home to sell.
Yeah, I think that'll definitely be more. I think it's another example. Something I've been thinking about a lot is that laws are slow. It's very slow to put in a law and put in regulation, and innovation tends to happen a little bit faster than what our regulations can meet them, and it tends to be slower than what the culture allows. And so I think you're kind of seeing that now. I think a lot of people who love to eat in the Bay Area have a comfort level with pop-ups and with people cooking out of their homes, especially if they know that those people have restaurant experience and have experience making, carrying, and working with food safety. Um, yeah, and I think eventually the laws will start to catch up. There will be demand. On that note, as far as predictions go, there's this other question of whether you think the parklets in San Francisco will continue once the pandemic's over.
Yeah, I mean, there is an expiration date on shared spaces. Um, but I could see restaurateurs and their restaurant associations really rallying to get those to become permanent fixtures, just because they put so much money into it. I went out for dinner before the latest lockdown, which has not been lifted, um, and asked the owner just straight up, like, how much is this parklet that we're eating in? And he said, tens of thousands of dollars, like 50K just to put something in. And of course, a week later, the outdoor dining was shut down. And I just kept thinking about him and just like, what do you do with that? How are you able to, I don't know, just like wake up in the morning and like get ready to do it again when you put so much money into something that just went poof, right? So I think that sentiment that, they really invested in it. They really invested in making them beautiful too. A lot of them with murals and like lights and scenery that I think people really respond to it. I go to North Beach a lot, and before, when outdoor dining was a thing, it was so popular and so vibrant, and we had so many conversations in the Bay Area about just the survival of North Beach, which has seen so many vacancies for so long, and just like economic difficulties for the storefronts. And to see that level of life there was really buoying in a time that has been so stressful for everybody. So yeah, I think people like what they add, you know.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think that it's so many of these parklets are taking up spaces that were previously just parked cars. And I think that's showing a lot of people the value of having shared spaces. And would they rather have a place to dine outdoors, or would they rather have another place to park a car? And uh, I think increasingly the reality is, I'd rather have the dining. Like, I'd rather have this closed street where we could walk. And I think there will be support for those kind of things to continue.
I think the one caveat is that because a lot of these parklets went up sort of ad hoc very quickly, there are a lot of issues with ADA compliance. And so I think places need to fix that because it's really important that people
Hmm.
can go down the street without having to like go into the street and other nonsense. Um, that's a huge part of the parklet thing that needs some addressing. But other than that, yeah, I think it's a really great program.
Yeah, let's do another question over here. Someone says they're concerned about how much delivery companies are charging restaurants. I want to support restaurants, but feel no need to support tech. Can you address this concern?
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't have the means or the ability to go straight to the restaurant to order, it can be really hard because if you don't have a friend who's willing to pick stuff up for you, like the easiest, the thing of least resistance is going with Caviar or Uber Eats or whatever. And certainly we've had a lot of internal conversations, like me and Serena, about just how we list places that are open for takeout and delivery. Do we put in the Postmates link on the top 25, or do we just pretend that that doesn't exist? It's really hard because we technically, right, ethically, cannot have like a really strong stance either way because that is what we cover, and it's important to be objective. Um, but also, it's an objective truth, right, that these companies take commissions out of restaurant profits that are very, very, very thin, like razor thin right now. And how do you present this information in a way that's fair? It doesn't also just like assume that um, getting delivery through this link is the best possible way to do things. I don't know. It's tough, right? It's up to every individual to figure out what they want to do and what their relationship to it is. Um, I mean, for me personally, I sometimes get delivery through the apps too because I just like am not able to go to a place, and I'm always feeling really guilty about it. I try not to do it too much. Uh,
Yeah,
um,
I totally hear
yeah.
that. I think that when we put the links in, the work that I rely on you for, Soleil, is that you have kind of done this dance already. Because I found that a lot of restaurants um, don't necessarily have the capacity to have their own delivery people. They don't necessarily have the capacity to build their own website for delivery. And kind of an app like Caviar or Seamless is their only option. And I don't know. I got really serious about calling every restaurant, and I still try to. If I want to order from a restaurant, I always call first to see if that's the best option and see what they're looking for. And a lot of times they're like, "Can you not call and just order through Caviar?"
Uh,
Or like,
yeah.
"Can you just do Uber Eats? Like, you should just do that." Especially if I'm not in the delivery range, but Uber Eats, I might not be in the delivery range for Caviar, but I might be in it for Uber Eats, just because of certain rules. And I do think ultimately uh, restaurants would rather just have you order than not order. And it's, I mean, no one's in a great situation here.
Right. I mean, there are some really interesting like third party services that I've noticed, like Take Home SF does meal kits from a bunch of different restaurants. Eat Benny, like BENNE, has pickup spots throughout San Francisco of certain restaurants that'll just like wine shops and stuff will host these like meals from restaurants that you can order, and they don't take any fees out, which is really interesting. But they're only available to a small number of restaurants. You know, like your average mom and pop like Indian restaurant is not going to sign up for this program because it's just too complicated, right? They just want that direct relationship. So it's weird, it's hard. I think the solution honestly is for restaurants to start hiring delivery drivers, and really publicize like we have in-house delivery, and some places already do have that. In that way, someone gets a good job, potentially with benefits, and they're able to keep all the money sort of in-house. I mean, when I was
Yeah.
growing up in New York City, that was normal. Everyone had their own delivery drivers.
But then also with having your own delivery drivers, I think I might be wrong on this, but I think there's all these other elements of like having certain insurance for those workers. And so it's
Mhm.
not always a clear cut, I can just hire these people, because then it's harder to predict demand. If you don't have as much demand that night, you're still paying the labor, and labor is very expensive. And
Mhm.
it's certainly not any clear cut thing. I mean, I think this is kind of proof, another example of how being an ethical consumer is very challenging. And we can all kind of try or do our best for that. But also, capitalism is not the solution to all our problems. that's
No.
kind of that's also my I'm not trying to be defeatist about it, but it is also a realization that, at the end of the day, everyone should do what they can to advocate for changes. And I think the public support is why we have delivery fee caps. I mean, that has just gained so much traction over the pandemic because of this exposure. And the delivery companies have been doing this for years, to be clear. These caps are something that the government could have put in before the pandemic started. And it has only happened because of years and years of advocacy and years of publicizing of this issue. And I think that's something to acknowledge and be hopeful about, is that we're even this question is even coming up right now is positive, because we have acknowledged the problem and there's public support for making some changes. The fact that delivery companies have the reputation for being evil means that there's possibility for change, because this was not even the front of mind, I think, for our industry or for government officials a couple years ago. And um, the caps are real. The caps have a real impact. And I think that a lot of the delivery workers, a lot of advocates for workers lost with the larger California law. But that there's momentum for this is a big deal. And I think that we are still at the beginning of this fight. And as far as it should not necessarily be entirely on us as consumers to make the right decision. And there is proof right now that there are more dramatic systemic changes to make sure that that's not the case.
Right.
So we're still early. There's still, I would like to think there's some hope that there is public support for more regulation on delivery companies. All right, another question. So we are currently a one critic town right now, which is you, Soleil. Soleil, do you enjoy having the city all to yourself, or would you relish having a second voice to either echo or dissent from your opinion?
Oh gosh. I mean, I would love having someone else do it too, because there's so many restaurants here that deserve coverage. And I mean, if I'm writing about one restaurant a week in depth, that it'll take years to really get to all the great ones. So yeah, I mean, spreading it out is super helpful, and it's also good for giving each other inspiration of just, places that might not have been on my radar. I think that's really great. So I'm an avid reader of other critics, the ones who
Soleil?
like, yes,
Oh, sorry, you froze a little bit for me. I don't know if it was
oh,
just me or not.
sorry.
It might be my internet.
I
Um,
think, well, I used to read, well, I still read like Eater SF, right? I used to be a huge fan of Catherine Hamilton, who was the critic at the East Bay Express. She did really awesome work, and now she works in Portland. But I think just reading other people's coverage is always helpful. I don't love being the sole voice echoing around in a big space, not at all.
yeah, and I would also argue that you're not necessarily. I mean, I still think, like I mentioned before, there is a lot of competition out there generally for people recommending restaurants. And it's only getting increasingly competitive. And I think it's good. I think that's good to have that, and why Soleil and the Chronicle are able to differentiate ourselves for food coverage, because there are other people eating food and trying it and recommending places. Would it be great to have another person as great as Soleil in town? Yeah, I think that would be pretty good. I mean, it's always good to have more competition for all of us to get better.
Mhm.
Um, for sure, there's just so many great places to eat, and it's definitely challenging to hit all of them. But again, Soleil is very communicative. Her email is out there. If you have a recommendation, that's how she finds it. You get recs from people.
Yeah, and I would also love to shout out this other website that I look at a lot, which caters to Chinese expats who live in California, especially. It's called Chihuo, Chihuo, and I read it a lot too to see like what like a lot of folks who are here for work or school, like what they miss and like the food that they're looking for. For instance, like there's a lot of these subgroups of like ethnic, like we talk a lot about like the ethnic newspapers, right? That used to proliferate throughout this country with diaspora. And there's a lot of food coverage that is also really siloed off, like in WeChat, for instance, and Weibo and these other like, non Twitters and Yelps. And it's always good to broaden my inspiration too.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Let's see. Do you read, Soleil, do you read reviews from areas outside the Bay Area?
Yeah, I mean, I read LA Times a lot, even though, it's not our coverage, but it's really great to see. I think I have a little bit of a sentimental feeling towards Patricia Escarcega, who started at the LA Times shortly before I started here, and Tejal Rao, who was sent out to California by the New York Times shortly before I came here. We're this like little collective of new critics, and Bill Addison, of course. And I like to keep up with what they're doing and what they're interested in as well. And they're primarily Los Angeles area. And then what else do I read? I do read reviews in places like New York, Chicago. Yeah, I mean, Tokyo too, I'm interested in since it's so close to us. It's interesting to see how things migrate back and forth. So to get a bird's eye view of trends and like what diners are interested in, what chefs are doing, and also how cuisines in other places are evolving, you gotta read widely.
Yeah, definitely. Another question. Something I really appreciate about the lists and reviews is your approach to writing about the food, the experience, and the stories of the people behind it. What's your approach to trying a restaurant and looking for the threads of how to write about it?
Oh, that's a really good question, because that is what I'm preoccupied with every day of my life right now. Ever since I started. I think that's what every critic does, right? If you want to go beyond talking about whether or not the steak was good, the wine was good, yada, 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 the service was nice, you have to start thinking, okay, how do I capture this experience for someone who hasn't been, or, went a long time ago and doesn't really quite remember, or, is trying to evaluate what this thing will add to their life. And it's, I guess, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for it, but I think about how a film critic like Manohla Dargis at the New York Times would write about the movie like 1917, right? It's not just about World War One. I don't know if this is too esoteric. I mean, whatever, but it's also about filmmaking. And you use the material that's presented to you to talk about like the act, like this meta thing that's going on, this thematic material. Restaurants are the same way, like they're texts, right? In the ideal world where we can actually go to restaurants and experience them, you sit in a room and you look at the color of the walls, you look at what's hanging on the walls, you listen to the music, you look at the typeface on the menu, and just the makeup of the people in the room, the way they talk to you and what dialect, right? All of that matters, and it all paints a picture. And if things go well, you don't notice. And that's the thing, right? If things go well in a live newscast, you don't see the microphone coming from above the shot. And so my job is to show people like where the microphone is and like why it's there and like what it's doing, if that makes sense. And so like finding that thread is the main preoccupation. That is the point of what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I want to say we always, yeah, it's not easy. We always have these conversations too, because there are plenty of good restaurants, and there's this question of which ones do you choose. And like Soleil and I are talking all the time about just brainstorming and thinking about, okay, yes, this restaurant's delicious, and we really think people should know about it. But what does it say about how we're eating right now? What does it say about the culture? What does it say about living in the Bay Area? How does it reflect the way people are cooking right now and the way people are eating? And there has to be some sort of, I don't know, thematical element to it. Like it has to speak to the time and reflect the time and say something more than, again, back to this question of there's so much competition out there. There's so many ways you could kind of skip, like people who, if you're here, then you're really interested in food. And I'm sure most people here have read through a Yelp review and kind of knows how to read Yelp now, where you can kind of tell which ones are more important to you and which reviews aren't going to matter as much. Um, and so in that case, like, you could just do that and not have a professional critic. So part of what Soleil's doing, it has to be more than just here the dishes are good and here are the dishes that aren't so great. It's kind of treating restaurants seriously as cultural. Uh, it's things that are part of our culture, an important part of our culture. I think a really great example of this is the fact that you've reviewed so many pop-ups in the last year, because that's really where a lot of the serious food making was happening. You think about Charles Chen from Basuku. I mean, there are like a gazillion new places selling Basque style cheesecake now, in part because of how popular what he was doing was. And you had so much background about him and why he was doing it. And he was very much a pandemic era food spot. And that was kind of the theme of that. Or I was same thing with Broke Ass Cooks and your review of them, or Horn Barbecue. I mean, everyone kind of, Horn Barbecue is so popular and the food is indeed very good. And you wrote beautifully about the food, but another thing that people know about Horn is that it has a really long line. So what does it say that during this pandemic, people are still willing to go out there and wait in this line? And the theme of that review was kind of, hey, this is still an experience and waiting in line. And during this pandemic, there are very few big events happening. And this is a place where you can still kind of feel like you're alive, basically. So I think that's definitely one of the more interesting aspects of discussing restaurants with you, and how we go about those reviews. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh my gosh, already?
Let's see. Wow. Yeah. How about this? Is it impossible to predict food trends given the fact that anything goes right now, or are you seeing trends?
Gosh, I think one trend that I've noticed is that there are a lot more restaurants that, or I guess pop-ups or like other projects that are beyond the traditional model of full service restaurants. I think people are scared, right, of what has happened in the past year, and they are trying to find models that are more limber, that will be able to adapt more readily if things get weird, and they can probably get weird again in our lifetimes. So how do you think about, many business leases are for years, right? 5, 10, 30 years. And can you predict what will happen in 30 years? It's really, really hard. And so I think people with food they want to make for other people are going to just seek out these alternative methods even more so now. I mean, it's not like this isn't a specific like food trend thing, but it's more just like a structural trend that, I think will resonate for a long time. A lot of us are traumatized by this, right? Like there's a lot that's become uncertain about daily life. I think that experience will mark us and many people who make food as well for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, as far as food itself, I mean, we've seen a lot of comfort foods pop up as essentially a reaction to the trauma of the people seeking comfort. But again, none of us can tell the future, but I'll be curious to see if once vaccines are more widespread, if some people are predicting kind of a roaring 20s style of resurgence. I don't know if that'll be exact. I don't certainly think there are people who would be looking for that, and I'm curious to see what the food will be like at those spots that are more going all out once we can be near each other again. Anyway, thank you, Soleil. Thank you to everyone here for joining us and your continued support of the Chronicle. Your support is why Soleil can do the work that she does, and that we can continue bringing you recommendations for incredible restaurants and all the great things we have to eat. If you have more questions, I'm sorry we did not get to all of them. Please feel free to reach out. You can email food@sfchronicle.com. We also are on social media, on Instagram and on Twitter, SF Chronicle Food. Soleil's podcast, I got to shout out, Extra Spicy. It's coming up. And every day SF Chronicle has a newsletter. You can sign up for that to get the ASAP news that we have every single day. Thank you so much.